Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. I want to welcome Mr. Tucker. He's our next presenter. We're going to follow the same format. Mr. Tucker will present, then there'll be a Q&A session following that. Welcome, Mr. Tucker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, can y'all hear me okay?
You might have to lean in a little closer.
Okay?
You're good.
All right. My name is Kelly Tucker. I'm Director of Oil and Gas Technology at New Mexico Junior College. This is my encore career. I've spent 35 years in the oil field with Baker Hughes. I retired. I've been at the junior college for approximately 3 years running the oil and gas technology program. I was raised on a farm outside of Lubbock, Texas. My grandparents purchased the farm in 1933. My sister and I still operate the farm. I was raised to be a steward of the land. I continue to be so. I graduated from Texas Tech University with a degree in petroleum engineering, and I've worked in the oil industry for 35 years. My wife Pamela, who's also my nurse this week as well, and I have called New Mexico home for 27 years. We have 1 son and 4 grandchildren. They reside in Andrews, Texas. Today I'm here to talk very briefly about some basic concepts of the oil and gas industry. Why is oil and natural gas important? Oil and natural gas are also called petroleum. They impact our lives much, much more than just fuel for our cars. Just a quick example, so I get to explain my broken wing here. I made a trip to the emergency room a couple of weeks ago, and of course the vehicle that drove me used gasoline. We all know that's an important use of petroleum. But what I saw in that emergency room that most people don't is that a huge part of it was made from petroleum. So from the plastic chairs to the syringes, to the medical gloves, to the Band-Aids, to the oxygen mask, to the oxygen tubes, to the monitors, to the pharmaceuticals. I even came home wearing a set of scrubs that were made from petroleum. Petroleum is an important part of our life. There are thousands of common products that we use every day that are made from petroleum. Simple things such as ink, toothpaste, shampoo, antibiotics, and even aspirin are made from petroleum. So the life cycle of a well. A very significant amount of planning followed by numerous approvals go into each well. And if you'll note on this slide that approximately 1 month is spent on drilling and completion, there's a year to 2 years that are spent on planning and approvals. After that process, the well is going to produce for decades. This slide shows 20 to 30 years. There's some wells out there that, well, we talked about the Discovery well in Lee County a while ago. It was drilled in 1928. It is still producing oil and gas. So wells can produce oil and gas a long time. Wells are constructed to protect aquifers. As a well is drilled, casing is placed in the well. Casing is thick-walled steel pipe. It then has cement pumped behind it to seal the gap between the hole and the pipe. This protects the water-bearing aquifers during the life of the well. Most New Mexico wells will have 3 strings of casing and cement. This well construction works. Lee County has over 14,000 producing oil and gas wells. Eddy County has approximately the same. Our communities have very high quality water. My healthy family has called New Mexico home for 27 years, and we've consumed this healthy water during the entire process. One quick comment about this diagram. I want you to note that it's a horizontal well. So it's drilled down, the vertical section curved, and then it goes out horizontally. It's a lateral. And we'll talk a little bit more about horizontal wells in a minute. Oops. Hydraulic fracturing. Oil and gas are trapped in underground rock formations. These are layers of rocks. They're not caverns, they're not pools, they're not rivers, they're not lakes, they're solid rock. If you look at this rock, it's going to resemble a very thick, rough concrete sidewalk. It's solid. The rock has tiny pores in it, similar to a sponge, only much, much smaller. That's where the oil and gas are stored. To produce a well, we have to be able to get that oil and gas in those tiny pores to the wellbore. So what is fracking? Fracking has been used in the oil field since 1949. It simply involves mixing proppant, which is normally sand, with a liquid, which is normally water, and then pumping it into the producing formation at a rate high enough to create a fracture, a crack. Cracks the rock. This creates a superhighway for the oil and gas to flow to the wellbore. So why is it important? If you look at this example on the screen, you'll see that a well that's predicted to produce 50 barrels of oil per day might not be economical without fracturing. So the same well, if it's fracked, could produce 750 barrels of oil per day. It would be economical. Without fracking, it would not be done. So the next statement is extremely important. Eliminate fracking and you eliminate most, if not all, new wells from being drilled in New Mexico and the United States. It doesn't eliminate the wells, it just eliminates them from being drilled here. The same wells would be drilled overseas, and for that reason you'll find that Russia, OPEC, are very strong supporters of the anti-fracking movement in the United States. This is a diagram of a frac job. Again, if you'll note that this well goes straight up and down, it's a vertical well. This job might take 1 to 5 days depending on the size. It takes place after the well has been drilled, after the drilling rig has moved off location. Note the equipment. You have a blender that mixes the water, sand, and chemicals together. You have pump trucks that take the slurry from the blender and multiply the pressure up to 3,000, 8,000 PSI. This slurry is pumped down the well, out perforations. Perforations are tiny holes that have been shot through the casing and cement into the oil and gas formation. The holes provide a flow channel from the formation to the wellbore, and the fracture actually goes out in 2 vertical wings. So it's going to go out vertical, 180 degrees. Depending on the design, they may go out 300 to 1,000 feet. And they only go as high as the top of the formation. So to have a productive oil and gas formation, the oil and gas has to be trapped. Part of that trap is a caprock on top of that formation. The fracture stays below that caprock. I mentioned horizontal wells. 85% of the wells being drilled in the United States today are horizontal wells. This is a diagram of a horizontal well frac. It's commonly called plug and perf. It's a common technique used to frac horizontal wells. The work is done in isolated zones, thousands of feet underground, with thousands of feet of solid rock above the fractured formation. This type of fracture is done in stages. It might be 5 stages, it might be 65 stages, depending on the size of the well. After fracking, the plugs are removed and the oil and gas are then produced from all of the fracked zones. So let's talk water. How much is required for frack jobs for the oil and gas industry? This data is directly from the New Mexico Office of the State Engineer. Note that the water used by the oil and gas industry is included with that used by the mining industry, and it is still a very, very small percentage. A portion of the water used to frack wells in the United States is recycled from the oil field. Not all the water used is fresh water. A portion of the water used to frack wells is non-potable brackish water. Comes from deep aquifers, it's clean, it's brackish, it's non-potable. So this slide has some volumes on it. Let's put it in perspective. I mentioned my grandparents' farm a little bit earlier. Small farm, quarter of a section. We have very good water, which means our 2 wells pump a good stream of water. We irrigate 125 acres, small farm. We irrigate approximately 3 to 6 months a year. Each day, that water pivot, that pivot runs, 1 million gallons of water goes on the ground. So in a typical farming season, that small farm will utilize approximately 100 million gallons of water. So how does that compare to a frac job? Every gallon of gasoline in New Mexico contains 10% ethanol. Ethanol is a biofuel made from crops, commonly corn. On a national average, 125 acres of corn will produce approximately 41,000 gallons of biofuel, ethanol. It requires 65 million gallons of water to be able to grow this corn. 65 million gallons of water will produce 1,000 barrels of fuel each year. A single oil well, fracked one time with 4 million gallons, might easily produce the same amount of energy every day for many years. 4 million gallons one time, and you produce the same amount of energy as that ethanol crop. You produce it every day with just an investment of 4 million gallons. Seismicity. You know, I've been practicing saying seismicity a lot. It's a hard word for me to say. But we routinely have small earthquakes in New Mexico. Some are felt, some are not. I do lots of classes in southeast New Mexico. I've done some up in this area. Every time I talk about seismicity, I'll ask people to raise their hand who's experienced an earthquake. We're not going to do that today. But in southeast New Mexico, nobody in the room will raise their hands. But I know for a fact up in this part of the world that most people in this room will raise their hands if they have experienced an earthquake. So if you live in southeast or northwest New Mexico where we have major oil and gas activity, earthquakes are extremely uncommon. In New Mexico, oil and gas production operations are not a trigger for seismic events as they have been in some areas of Oklahoma. And if you'll note on this slide, straight from the USGS, hydraulic fracturing is not what causes induced seismic activity. What's occurring in Oklahoma has been attributed to disposing of wastewater, so it's disposal wells. In New Mexico, the disposal wells are the same, but the geology is very, very different. It does not induce earthquakes. So produced water disposal. Most oil and gas wells naturally produce water with the oil and gas. The vast majority of this water is from prehistoric oceans that existed when the oil and gas was formed. This slide simply shows where the oil field produced water comes from and the various disposal methods. Again, be aware produced water disposal and fracking are entirely different animals. And if you're interested, this is why New Mexico Junior College allows me to be here, so please indulge me. If you're interested in learning more, I do a 2-day class on a quarterly basis, and you're invited. So, Mr. Chairman, I told you 15 minutes, it's 15 and a half minutes.
All right, you did a good job, Mr. Tooker. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I want to entertain my fellow commissioners if they have any questions for Mr. Tooker. Commissioner Ball.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, sir. That was fantastic briefing.
Thank you.
Appreciate you putting that together, and students, and coming up with that. You know, water conservation here in New Mexico is critically important all across the state, whether we talked about it during economic development with Facebook and Los Lunas and how much water they're going to use in relation to, you talked about agriculture and obviously fracking. Is there something the industry does or can do to ensure that water is consistently being used efficiently on site? They're either through new technologies or other built-in efficiencies that you guys do during drilling operations?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Block, yes, there is. There is a massive amount of R&D that's taken place in the oil industry. Companies like Schlumberger, Baker, GE, Halliburton, and a lot of the larger oil companies, this is one of their biggest focuses, is recycling water. So there's different techniques that are used. Some wells might be fracked with produced water from an offset well that's been cleaned up. Some wells might be fracked, I mentioned brackish water we can't use. They might be fracked with that. Some wells might be fracked with flowback water that's actually flowed back from a previous frack job that's been cleaned up and reused. There's also percentages. You might use 20% recycled water and 80% fresh water. So it's there. The factor that drives that, there's two factors. One is economics. Where we are in southeast New Mexico, in most cases, it's less expensive to use fresh water than to pay to recycle oil-filled water. So as the fresh water becomes more scarce, the economics will be more in favor of recycling. In areas where there's not as much fresh water to be used, the recycling would most likely be very economical. The second function or factor that would drive reuse is corporate responsibility. So there's a lot of oil companies out there that are working harder to portray a green image, and so they might spend that extra 25 cents a barrel to use recycled water. There's lots of technology and it's being developed.
Okay. Thank you, sir. You know, one of the things that I hear about and we see on the news is seismic activity, and thank you for talking about that. What I don't understand is, you talked about the geology is different between New Mexico and Oklahoma. So it's pretty damn easy to see above the surface the differences between our two states. Ours is way better, by the way.
Right.
Right, okay. But when you're going down, you know, about 8,000 to 10,000 feet, can you tell us the differences in geology in Oklahoma versus New Mexico related to seismic activity?
So I actually had a slide in here about Oklahoma seismic activity, but to trim this down to our 15 minutes, it got removed. But I'm definitely prepared to talk about that.
Then just briefly.
Okay. There's a study from 2015, but done by Stanford University if you're interested in the details.
I've seen it.
But the seismic activity in Oklahoma is related to disposing of oil field wastewater, injecting it downhole. It's changed the pore pressures and it's triggered pre-existing stresses that are in the rocks to happen sooner. They might not have happened for 100 years or 1,000 years, but with the injection of the wastewater, it's triggered them to happen within a week or a month or 5 years. So the disposal water, it's being addressed. Once they learned what the problem was, it's being remediated. They've actually shut in 4 of the wells, four out of probably 1,000, and they've reduced the seismic activity by 20%. So 4 wells were causing a major part of it.
When you say seismic activity, are you talking
Thank you.
3.0 and below, or anything above that?
Yes, some people would call these tremors. A lot of these would not be felt. So whenever we're watching a Hollywood feature movie and houses are shaking and things are falling off the shelf, that's not what's happening. What's happening is what we feel in central New Mexico, where the earth shakes a little bit and you go, what was that? So they're very, very small, yes.
You know, you've been doing this for about 35 years, you mentioned, in the industry. And if fracking were not an option in this county or even in this state, what would production in New Mexico look like today, and how would that affect us economically and environmentally?
No, I love that question, Commissioner Block. First off, from an oil and gas production standpoint, if fracturing was not allowed, you would see little or no new production, new wells being drilled. Where right now, we have in the neighborhood of 50 drilling rigs operating. If fracking was eliminated, you would probably have less than 5, maybe less than 2. I don't know. It would stop. Production, the daily production in New Mexico today is approximately 400,000 barrels of oil per day. Oil wells, gas wells have a natural decline. They don't produce as much oil next year as they did last year. National average for conventional wells is 6% decline. That being said, you know, without new drilling, without fracking, without new drilling, you would see the 400,000 in a period of 4 years, 5 years, drop to 300,000. You know, 6 or 7 years after that, it would drop to 200,000.
Yep.
It would go away.
Okay, thank you. Just 2 more quick ones, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned in your brief the 99.5% of water, and the 0.5% wasn't discussed. What is that chemical, and is that on like some type of, in my background with the Air Force, as a nuclear guy, we use MSDSs for different chemicals that we use for nuclear operations and nuclear maintenance. Can you tell me what that chemical is, and is it regulated by some type of MSDS?
Yes and no. Yes. I actually had a slide, another one that got cut. But MSDS, Material Safety Data Sheet, is a document that's required by law. It's required to show hazardous materials. So if you look at an MSDS for a product that's used on a frac job, it's not going to say 99% good stuff, 1% bad stuff. All it's going to say is 1% bad stuff. So the chemicals that are used, the main one that you'll see is some type of polymer. If you go to Albertsons, you can buy a product that has that exact same polymer in it, whether it's ketchup or ice cream. It's very common. So there may be 10 basic ingredients that go into frac jobs. The core ingredient, the prime ingredient, is common to what we use every day in our lives. Now, that being said, those hazardous materials that will show up on that safety data sheet might include things like IPA, isopropyl alcohol, rubbing alcohol, ethylene glycol, antifreeze, methanol, things like that. They're hazardous for a reason. Some are poisonous, some are flammable, but yes, they'll show up. And they're in those chemicals, in those compounds that are used to make the frac fluid, for the simple reason is they hold the other ingredients together. They work as binders. They make it stick together where they can actually use the material. So, and one point I want to make that I don't think I've ever read or seen this, but be aware that 0.5% of chemicals that's in that water is pumped thousands of feet underground, 8,000, 10,000 feet into an oil or gas bearing formation. It then is produced back over the life of that well, right back out. It goes into the ground, it comes out of the ground, it's disposed of in regulated disposal wells. OCD was just up here earlier. They do an awesome job. They do a great job monitoring that and making sure it's taken care of. So my point being is the chemicals that are in frac water, they don't come back on the ground. They don't go into our ecosystem. We don't consume them. They're gone. Once they go down that well, they're gone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again, sir. I have a couple more questions, but I'd like to talk to you offline about those. And
Thank you.
I
Glad
hope
to.
I hope your arm heals up, and if I could give you one.
I really enjoyed all the nursing I've
Yeah,
got.
if I could give you one real key piece of advice is do the physical therapy. Don't skip out on that. Trust me.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you, Mr. Commissioner Block and Mr. Tucker. Now,
millions of gallons of water, injecting those into the wells, and that's what that is resulting in. And they even, in their publication, they show a graph that shows how the number
Use
of
your microphone.
how the number of earthquakes actually increases as you increase the pressure of the injection in those wells. And so my question would be, do you know what the pressure of the injection is in New Mexico, in areas like around Cuba where they're injecting into those disposal wells?
So to answer the question, do I know what the pressure of the injection pressure of disposal wells is in southeast New Mexico? Every well is different, but most disposal wells in southeast New Mexico are on a vacuum. They don't use pressure. It just actually just sucks the water out of the tank and it goes away. Now, there's some wells where there is pressure. That pressure is regulated by the OCD to a maximum. And what that is, I cannot tell you.
Okay, thank you very much.
all right, thank you, Mr. Howell. Mr. Neese, do you have a question? Thank you.
Mr. Cooper, how many gallons of water does it take to produce?
Use your microphone.
Closer? Okay. How many gallons of water does it take to produce 1 gallon of gas or oil?
I don't know.
Okay, and also, are you familiar with, on the OCD website and state engineer's website, according to those two entities, nearly 2 billion gallons of water is used in fracking processes and disposed down into disposal wells. Are you familiar with that? Is that true? 2 billion gallons.
I'm not familiar with that number.
Never to to rejoin the natural water cycle?
Well, you know, that's a good point. That used to be one of my concerns in my earlier days, that whenever we put fresh water down a disposal well, it's gone forever. But be aware that when we produce oil, natural gas out of a well, and we consume it, I'm gonna assume that nearly everybody in this room actually came in a vehicle that was powered by gasoline or diesel.
Yes, sir.
Okay. When you burn that gasoline, you're converting gasoline plus oxygen into water and CO2. So even though we're losing that water down hole, the oil that comes out is converted back to water, fresh water.
So you're saying that, the natural water cycle is actually producing new water, for us to use through the burning of petroleum products?
Burning of petroleum products releases water that was put in the ground 200 million years ago. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, thank you, Mr. Neese. Mr. Gessing, did you have a question? No? Okay, all right. I want to thank you, Mr. Tooker. Oh, we have another question? All right, I'm going to entertain it.
Mr. Tucker, thanks for being here today. The question I have is that you made a statement that I found was really interesting. You said that anti-fracking is supported both by OPEC and Russia and the groups here in the United States. Do you have direct evidence of that, or is this another Hillary, attack on Russia
You know,
and OPEC and whatever?
the evidence I have is basically just comes off the internet, so for whatever that's worth, and it's basically articles that have showed the Russians tied to banks in the Bahamas that actually fund anti-fracking industry, and that's what that's based on. But let me add something to that. That you eliminate oil and gas production in the United States. United States, in some categories, is the number one liquid oil producer in the world by far.
I'm not
And
disputing that, sir.
we're on our way to being the number one crude oil producer.
Yes,
You-
however, most of that's going for exports.
You eliminate fracking, and for every barrel that we don't produce, Russia and OPEC will produce one more.
Right, well, we're wasting a lot of the material. It's heading on down south to Mexico. It's not being used here, for example. We have a new pipeline that'll be running about 500,000 barrels of oil a day on down to Mexico. And so you asked it that we're having it being used here for our use. It's not. It's actually going for export. But that said, the equivalence that you say that you set in a hospital, and you said that all this stuff is being manufactured by the fact that we have a petroleum industry, would you state to me that there is absolutely no reason why we can't go ahead and do substitution instead of doing fracking? Is there other materials that can be used? For example, there's a Mercedes-Benz car that was basically built out of hemp. Oh, but I forgot, New Mexico doesn't allow for additional hemp production.
All right, thank you,
But
sir.
we'll allow for you.
And we do use more petroleum in the United States than we produce by far.
Mr. Tooker, thank you so much. I really appreciate you considering you're injured that you came today. Appreciate your presentation. We're going to move on to our next presenter. I want to thank you, sir.